It starts with a photograph, a picture taken in 1915 that holds a secret few have noticed. Three sisters, smiling innocently in the photograph, posing together in a moment frozen in time. But here's the twist. Only two of them were alive when the photo was taken. How is that possible? This peculiar image, yellowed with age, was tucked away in an old album, forgotten by all but those who once cared about it. For decades, it sat untouched, its story lost to time. But now, a question remains unanswered. How did one of the sisters, who had passed away several years earlier, end up in this photograph, grinning alongside her siblings as if nothing had changed? The photograph was discovered by an unsuspecting historian, who was drawn to it by sheer curiosity. As the story behind the photo began to unfold, the mystery grew deeper. Who was responsible for capturing such an impossible moment? What force or series of events allowed a deceased child to appear in a photo, with no sign of anything unusual on the surface? The answers to these questions are not simple, nor are they found in conventional history books. The photograph seems to defy logic, and as the historian digs deeper, strange anomalies begin to emerge. But why was this picture taken in the first place? Who knew about it, and who decided to keep its secrets hidden for so long? This is the story of three sisters, one of whom seemingly transcended death to appear in a family portrait. A story that has remained buried in time for over a century. As we unravel the clues behind this haunting mystery, we will take you step by step through the details of the photograph, the history of the sisters, and the shocking discoveries that still resonate today. Do you believe in the impossible? Have you ever wondered what lies beyond the frame of a photograph? Stay tuned as we uncover the truth behind this eerie moment captured forever in time. Subscribe and comment below to share your thoughts on this mystery. Welcome to Grave of the Shadows, where the past holds its secrets, and we dig deep to reveal them. The year is 1915, a time when the world was teetering on the brink of profound change. World War I raged across Europe, and the lives of ordinary people were marked by uncertainty, loss, and a yearning for stability. Photography, still in its relative infancy, had become a popular means of capturing memories, a way for families to preserve their fleeting moments in time, especially in an era fraught with turmoil. Amid this backdrop, three sisters posed for a photograph in their family home. The image shows them together, dressed in the fashion of the time, their smiles bright, their youthful innocence captured forever. On the surface, this photograph seems to be nothing more than a typical family snapshot, nothing that would hint at the strange mystery hidden within its frame. But what if this seemingly simple image held a secret that could not be explained by ordinary means? The photograph was discovered years later, in the attic of an old, uninhabited house, buried beneath stacks of forgotten papers and photographs. The moment it was unearthed, it became clear that something was amiss. The date written on the back, 1915, seemed to confirm its authenticity. But as experts examined it closely, they noticed something unsettling. One of the sisters, whom the family had claimed to have lost years before the photo was taken, was smiling brightly, standing alongside her living sisters. How could this be? The photograph itself was not poorly taken. In fact, it was quite clear, with every detail sharply defined. Their faces, their clothing, the faint but noticeable smudge of dust on the windowsill. But as the image was enhanced, something even stranger became apparent. The third sister, who had passed away in 1912, was visible, unmistakably present, yet her image shouldn't have been there at all. Family records confirmed her tragic death just 3 years before the photograph was taken. In 1912, the sister had succumbed to a deadly illness. The grief-stricken parents had struggled to cope with the loss, and the family had been torn apart by the event. The remaining sisters had moved on, living their lives, but the memory of their sibling, though painful, remained locked in the past. Yet somehow this girl had been included in the family portrait, a photograph that seemed to have been taken well after her death. A clue had been unearthed in this mystery, but it was only the beginning. Was this a mere mistake? A trick of the camera? Or was something more sinister at play? Something that transcended the ordinary? The investigation into the photograph became a race against time, and what began as a simple examination of a family relic turned into a search for answers that would defy the boundaries of the real world. The mystery deepened further when researchers uncovered that the photograph had been taken by a renowned photographer of the era, known for capturing the essence of everyday life. His skill with the camera was unparalleled, making it even more puzzling that he could have made such a mistake. The sharpness of the image and the evident skill behind the lens ruled out the possibility of a poor photograph. This left only one explanation. Something far more perplexing was hidden beneath the surface. As experts continued to examine the photograph, they discovered more anomalies. Despite the presence of the deceased sister, the picture appeared perfectly ordinary at first glance. There were no obvious signs of manipulation or digital tampering. Such things didn't exist at the time. The photograph, much like the sisters it depicted, held a silent secret, one that would take decades to unearth. The more we uncover about the photograph and the family's tragic past, the more it becomes clear. This was no ordinary family portrait. The question now looms larger than ever. How could a deceased child, who had been gone for years, appear in a photograph taken well after her death? Could there be more to the story than meets the eye? Stay tuned as we continue our investigation into the three sisters and the eerie photograph that has captured the world's attention for over a century. The photograph in question is more than just an image. It is a glimpse into the lives of three sisters, whose bond and tragedy intertwine in ways no one could have predicted. To truly understand the mystery behind the photograph, we must first delve into the lives of these three women, their childhoods, and the profound loss that shaped their family. The elder sister, Margaret Harrington Margaret, the eldest of the three sisters, was the one who often took on the role of protector. Born in 1900, Margaret was already an adult by the time the photograph was taken in 1915. A calm and collected young woman, she had an air of maturity about her, even in her youth. Her responsibilities weighed heavily on her shoulders, especially after their mother passed away when Margaret was just 14. This left her to care for her younger siblings, particularly Sarah, who was only 7 at the time. Margaret was a practical person, one who often relied on reason and composure to handle difficult situations. However, behind her stoic demeanor lay a woman who longed for freedom and adventure, dreams which were often stifled by the weight of family duty. Despite her internal struggles, Margaret held a strong sense of familial duty and love for her sisters, particularly for Sarah, the youngest. The middle sister, Sarah Harrington Sarah, born 2 years after Margaret, was the more free-spirited and lively of the two. She was the artist in the family, always seen sketching in her notebooks or daydreaming. Known for her wild imagination, Sarah often created worlds of her own, pulling her sisters into the fantasy she had built. A picture of innocence and creativity, Sarah was also highly sensitive and emotional, often retreating into herself when the weight of reality became too much. Her creativity was perhaps her most prominent trait, and it was through her that the family learned to see the world through a different lens. But Sarah's free spirit came at a cost. She was often seen as difficult by her family, as she did not adhere to the expected norms of propriety and behavior that were standard for young women of the time. This sometimes caused tension within the household, especially with Margaret, who often tried to impose a sense of responsibility on her younger sister. Though she loved her family dearly, Sarah found solace in the more abstract and surreal, often turning to art or stories to express the emotions that were too complicated for words. Little did anyone know, it was her wild imagination that would become intertwined with the inexplicable events that followed. The youngest sister, Alice Harrington Alice, the youngest of the three, was born in 1907. She was the sister who had passed away in 1912, 3 years before the photograph was taken. A spirited and outgoing child, Alice was full of life, always laughing and full of energy. Her sister Sarah often described her as the sunshine of the family, someone whose presence could lift even the heaviest hearts. Alice was the baby of the family, adored by all who knew her, and she quickly became the focal point of her sisters' lives. Despite her tender age, Alice's death left a permanent scar on the family. She had contracted a severe illness, and after a long battle, she succumbed to its effects. The loss was devastating, particularly for Margaret, who had always been protective of Alice. The family's grief was palpable, and the sisters, especially Sarah, found it difficult to cope with the void left by Alice's absence. The photograph, a family portrait with a disturbing secret. The photograph was taken at a time when the wounds of Alice's passing were still fresh. Margaret and Sarah had been living with the painful memory of losing their youngest sister. And yet, in this image, Alice was somehow still with them. There is a certain innocence in their smiles, but also an underlying sense of something missing. The photo captures the essence of their complex relationship, the love, the loss, and the unspoken grief. As experts examined the photo, they began to wonder, how did Alice appear in this photograph? Was it possible for the human mind to manifest the image of a loved one who had passed away, even if just in the subconscious? Or was there something more to this picture than mere human imagination? The investigation into the photograph would ultimately uncover more than just the history of the Harrington family. It would unravel a complex web of connections between life, death, and what might lie beyond. The photograph of the three sisters, which initially seemed like an ordinary family portrait, soon began to reveal unsettling details that raised more questions than answers. As the photograph was closely examined, strange anomalies began to surface, each one pointing to something far beyond the realm of simple photographic error. The first oddity that was discovered was the clarity of the image. Photographs taken in the early 20th century were often grainy, lacking the sharpness that modern cameras could achieve. However, this particular photograph stood out. The details were unusually crisp, especially for its time. The texture of the sisters' clothing was so vivid that it felt as if the photograph had been taken just yesterday. The clarity was striking, almost as if the photo had been taken with technology that wouldn't emerge for decades to come. But it wasn't the image quality alone that was troubling. As experts studied the photo more closely, they discovered something that seemed impossible. The presence of Alice, the youngest sister, who had passed away in 1912. At first glance, she appeared to be standing there, smiling with her sisters, as if nothing had changed. This was not a trick of the light or a misidentified family member. This was Alice, clear as day. Yet, the date on the photograph, 1915, made it impossible for her to be there. The more the photograph was analyzed, the more curious it became. The shadows in the image were off, not quite falling as they should have according to the position of the sunlight streaming through the window. The lighting was inconsistent, almost as though the photo had been taken during different times of the day or under different circumstances. There was also an odd, almost imperceptible glow around Alice's figure, as if she were not fully part of the physical world. The glow wasn't visible in the other two sisters, but it hovered around Alice, casting an ethereal aura that seemed to defy explanation. As the investigation deepened, another strange detail came to light. One of the family's old diaries, written by Margaret, described a peculiar conversation she had had with Sarah just days before the photograph was supposedly taken. In the diary, Margaret noted that Sarah had been speaking to Alice in her room late at night, as if the child had never truly left them. Margaret had assumed it was a form of grief, a way for Sarah to cope with the loss of her sister. But now, after viewing the photograph, the diary entry took on a different meaning. Was it possible that Sarah, still mourning Alice, had somehow conjured the image of her sister in this photograph through the sheer force of her will? Or was there something more sinister at play? Some force beyond their understanding that had somehow allowed Alice to return, if only for a brief moment? With these questions in mind, the photograph was taken to a team of experts in paranormal studies, photographers, and historians. The experts were baffled by the findings. They confirmed that the photo had not been altered or manipulated in any way. The photograph had been developed using the same methods as others from that era, and no signs of tampering were found. However, they could not provide a clear explanation for the inexplicable presence of Alice in the image. One expert, Dr. Judith Simmons, a renowned historian of early 20th century photography, offered a suggestion. What if this photograph wasn't taken at all in 1915? What if it was taken in a different time, but somehow captured in this frame? Could there be something about this particular moment, this family, that caused the photograph to transcend time and reality? The suggestion was as fascinating as it was frightening. Could it be that the photograph was somehow not bound by the laws of time? Could it have been a momentary breach where Alice's presence was temporarily restored in the world of the living? The implications were chilling. If this was true, then it would mean that there was more to the photograph than mere memory. It might have been a glimpse into something far more extraordinary, a supernatural occurrence that defied all logical explanation. As the photograph continued to be examined and analyzed, it became clear that the mystery surrounding it was only just beginning. There were more questions than answers, and the deeper the investigation went, the more uncertain the path became. Was this a simple photograph that had somehow captured a family's grief? Or was it a window into something far darker and more mysterious, something that transcended time, death, and reality itself? The investigation into the photograph and the strange presence of Alice had only just begun, and the answers seemed to lie in the shadow of something far more elusive than anyone could have imagined. As the mystery of the photograph grew more complex, so did the investigation. Dr. Eliza Langley, a historian and expert in early 20th century photography, was brought in to analyze the image. Her initial reaction was one of skepticism, but as she examined the photograph more closely, she began to notice details that could not be explained by ordinary means. There was something unsettling about the image, something that called out for answers. Dr. Langley began her investigation by looking into the background of the photograph. The sisters' home, where the photo was reportedly taken, had been located in a quiet part of the countryside. Built in the late 1800s, the house had witnessed generations of the Harrington family living within its walls. According to local records, the house had been sold after Alice's death, and the family had moved away, never returning. But what struck Dr. Langley most was a small detail she noticed when studying the photograph's background: the wallpaper. In the image, the wallpaper in the room where the photo had been taken was unlike anything that would have been in fashion in 1915. The intricate design, full of delicate patterns and deep, rich colors, seemed more befitting of an earlier era, perhaps a decade or two before. This discovery led Dr. Langley to delve further into the history of the Harrington family home. Through her research, she uncovered that the house had undergone several renovations over the years. The most significant of these had taken place just after Alice's death, when the house was briefly abandoned and sold. The renovations included replacing the wallpaper in all the rooms, including the one where the photograph had been taken. But what was most curious was the timing of the photograph. According to historical records, Alice had died in 1912, yet the renovations had been completed months before the photo was supposedly taken. Dr. Langley wondered if the photograph had been taken during a time when the wallpaper, which had been in place before the renovations, had still been part of the room. Could this mean the photo was not taken in 1915, as the family had claimed? The deeper Dr. Langley dug into the history of the house and the photograph, the more inconsistencies she uncovered. Each new discovery seemed to reveal more questions than answers. What's more, the family's diary entries from the time following Alice's death revealed increasingly strange and cryptic statements from the remaining sisters. Margaret, in particular, had begun to document in great detail the odd behavior she had observed in Sarah. In one entry, dated just months before the photograph was taken, Margaret described Sarah as speaking to someone who isn't there. She wrote that Sarah often mentioned the one who isn't with us, referring to Alice. Margaret had attributed this behavior to Sarah's grief, a way for her to cope with the loss of her younger sister. But now, in light of the strange occurrences surrounding the photograph, Dr. Langley couldn't help but wonder, was Sarah's grief merely a coping mechanism, or was there something more at play? Perhaps something supernatural? Margaret's entries became more troubling as time passed. In one particularly alarming letter to a friend, she confessed that she had witnessed Sarah in her room late at night, talking to someone invisible, her face pale and drawn with an eerie expression. "It is as though Alice has never left," Margaret wrote. "I fear that Sarah may be losing herself in the past. She speaks of Alice's presence as though she still walks among us." The photograph, when viewed in this context, became even more perplexing. Had Sarah, in her grief, somehow conjured the image of Alice into existence once more? Or could there have been another, more unexplainable force at work, one that reached across the boundaries of life and death? The presence of Alice in the photograph, captured as clearly as her living sisters, suggested that the lines between the two worlds, this one and the next, were far more porous than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Langley's findings led her to believe that the photograph was not simply an accident or a result of misinterpretation. Something had happened on that day in 1915, something that allowed Alice to appear alongside her sisters, defying the passage of time. The question remained: how? Was it possible that Sarah's emotional state had somehow triggered a rift in time, bringing Alice back into the world, if only for a brief moment? The investigation had now taken a darker turn. As more and more anomalies were discovered, the mystery surrounding the photograph began to take on a life of its own. The once innocent family portrait had become a window into a much larger and more terrifying question. Was it possible for the dead to return, if only for a fleeting moment? As Dr. Langley continued to investigate, she knew one thing for certain: the photograph was only the beginning. The answers lay hidden in the past, and the only way to uncover them was to continue down the shadowy path of the unknown. As the investigation into the photograph continued, the picture became much larger than anyone could have anticipated. The mysteries surrounding Alice's presence in the image were only the surface of a far deeper story, one filled with secrets, loss, and unexplained occurrences that had long been hidden from the public eye. The family of the Harrington sisters had always been seen as a picture of upper-class propriety. Their home, a stately house on the outskirts of London, was a testament to their wealth and status. Edmund Harrington, their father, was a well-respected photographer whose work had been featured in prominent society magazines. His talent for capturing the essence of the people he photographed made him well known in artistic circles. But behind the facade of the perfect family lay a history filled with tragedy. Alice's death in 1912 had been the catalyst for the unraveling of the Harrington family. At just 5 years old, Alice had been the life of the household, a sweet, energetic child who had a knack for making everyone laugh, even in the most difficult of times. Her sudden illness and subsequent death from a rare and aggressive fever left her family in a state of shock. Margaret, the eldest, was devastated by the loss, but it was Sarah who took the death hardest. Sarah, only 10 at the time, had been inseparable from Alice. The two shared a bond that was unspoken but deep. They spent hours playing together, creating imaginary worlds where they were the rulers of kingdoms, and their bond was something that no one, not even Margaret, could fully understand. The family's grief was compounded by a strange series of events following Alice's death. Within weeks, the remaining sisters began to notice odd occurrences in the house. Sarah would sometimes be found speaking to someone who wasn't there. Margaret, in her journals, described Sarah as lost in a world of her own, often mumbling Alice's name as if she were still alive. At first, Margaret dismissed this as normal grief, the kind that everyone experiences after losing a loved one. But the odd behavior only intensified as time went on. A particularly chilling moment was documented in Margaret's journal. In it, she wrote that one evening, as she was preparing dinner, she heard Sarah laughing in the garden. It was a sound she recognized immediately. It was Alice's laugh, the one that had once filled the house with joy. Margaret rushed outside, only to find Sarah sitting alone in the garden, her face pale and her eyes wide. When Margaret asked her what had happened, Sarah simply replied, "Alice came to visit me." Margaret brushed it off as a child's fantasy, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This strange behavior culminated in a series of disturbing events in the months leading up to the photograph. In a letter to a close friend, Margaret described Sarah's obsession with the idea that Alice was still with them. She would talk about Alice as though she were alive, saying that her sister had come back to be with them. "I hear her footsteps in the halls at night," Sarah confessed to Margaret one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's here, Margaret. She's not gone." Margaret, who had always been practical and grounded, was terrified. She began to worry that Sarah's grief had led her to lose touch with reality. The more Sarah talked about Alice's return, the more Margaret began to question her own sanity. Could it be possible that Sarah's mind had played tricks on her? Or could there be something else at work, something beyond their understanding? The turning point came when Margaret decided to confront Sarah about the photograph. They had been in the sitting room together when Sarah suddenly stood up, walking over to a cabinet and pulling out a small, antique photograph frame. Inside was the family portrait that had been taken just days before Alice's death. Sarah had always kept it close, but this time, she had something different in mind. She placed the frame on the table in front of Margaret and said, "I want you to see her, Margaret. She's still here." At first, Margaret didn't understand. The photograph was old, its edges frayed, and it showed the sisters before Alice's illness took hold of her. But as Margaret looked closer, she realized something that sent a chill down her spine. There was a shadowy figure behind Sarah, barely noticeable at first. It was a subtle distortion in the light, but as Margaret focused on it, she saw what it truly was. A faint image of Alice, standing just behind Sarah, as though she were still alive, looking over her shoulder. Margaret's heart raced as she stared at the photograph, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of Sarah's imagination? Or was there something far more unexplainable happening? The unsettling discovery led Margaret to seek answers. She turned to experts in photography, but they found no explanation for the strange presence in the image. The photograph was genuine, and nothing in the frame suggested any form of manipulation. It was as if Alice had somehow been captured in that moment, frozen in time alongside her living sisters. As Margaret delved deeper into her investigation, she found an old family letter that mentioned a peculiar occurrence. The sisters had received a visit from a man shortly before the photograph was taken. He was a photographer, an acquaintance of their father, who had been commissioned to take the family portrait. But when Margaret spoke to their father about the visit, he seemed uncomfortable and evasive, as if he were hiding something. The more Margaret uncovered, the more she began to realize that this photograph was not merely an image. It was a key to understanding something far more mysterious than the death of a child. But the questions only deepened. What had happened in the moments before the photograph was taken? How had Alice appeared in the frame? And why had their father been so secretive about the photographer? The investigation into the photograph had already led to unsettling discoveries. But as the clues began to pile up, an even more disturbing truth started to take shape. What had begun as a simple family mystery was quickly becoming something far darker. A tale that seemed to stretch beyond the realm of natural explanation and into the eerie corners of the unknown. As Margaret dug deeper into the family's history, she began to uncover old letters, some dating back to before Alice's death. These letters, written by family members and acquaintances, spoke of strange occurrences that had been dismissed as mere coincidences at the time. But in light of the photograph and the mysteries surrounding Alice's supposed return, they began to seem far more significant. One letter, written by Alice's nurse, described a particularly chilling incident. The nurse recounted how, just days before Alice fell ill, the little girl had wandered through the house late at night, speaking in a voice that sounded not quite her own. According to the nurse, Alice had told her that she had seen someone in the house, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. She said the person was tall and shadowy, standing in the corner of the room. "I thought she was having a nightmare," the nurse wrote, but Alice's description of the figure didn't match any known person in the family, nor did it seem to fit the shadowy corners of a child's imagination. Another letter from the family's housekeeper, written shortly before Alice's death, spoke of strange noises in the house during the night. "I heard tapping on the windows, but when I went to check, no one was there," she wrote. "And sometimes, the air feels thick with something I can't explain. It's as though there's a presence, something that shouldn't be." The letters painted a picture of a house filled with unexplained occurrences, yet they were all dismissed at the time as nothing more than coincidences, the overactive imaginations of those who were grieving. But now, in the context of the photograph and the eerie events that had followed, these strange happenings began to form a chilling pattern. A pattern that suggested something supernatural had been at work in the Harrington home long before the photograph was taken. Margaret, already unnerved by the events surrounding the photograph, began to experience strange occurrences herself. Late at night, she would hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the hallways, only to find the house empty. On one occasion, she woke in the middle of the night to find the same photograph of the three sisters sitting on her desk, its edges curling as though it had been touched recently, though no one had been in her room. As the weeks passed, Margaret's obsession with the photograph grew. She became fixated on finding answers, even if it meant confronting things she wasn't ready to understand. She reached out to spiritualists and mediums, hoping they could provide some insight into the strange occurrences surrounding Alice's image. But the answers they gave her were cryptic at best, and often left her more confused than before. Some claimed that Alice's spirit had never truly left the house, that her presence lingered in the photograph as a sign of unfinished business. Others suggested that the photograph itself might be a window into another time or dimension, one where the boundaries between life and death were blurred. As Margaret's search for answers intensified, so did the tension within her family. Sarah, who had once been so close to Alice, became more withdrawn, often refusing to leave her room. She claimed that Alice spoke to her in her dreams, urging her to find the truth. But Margaret could no longer tell if Sarah's behavior was a result of grief or if there was something far more sinister at play. The more Margaret investigated, the more she realized that the photograph was no mere family keepsake. It was a portal to something beyond their understanding. And the closer she got to uncovering the truth, the more the strange occurrences seemed to escalate. Was Alice's presence truly in the photograph? Or was it something darker? Something that had been lingering in the shadows for far too long? The investigation was no longer just about the photograph. It had become a battle against forces far beyond their comprehension, and Margaret was beginning to wonder if she could handle the truth, or if it would consume her, as it had consumed the rest of the Harrington family. The mysteries surrounding the photograph of the three sisters had reached a fever pitch. Margaret, now consumed by her quest for answers, had begun to connect the dots between the strange occurrences, the unexplained presence of Alice in the photo, and the eerie patterns in her family's history. It was becoming clear that the photograph was not just a mere snapshot. It was the key to something far greater, something that bridged the gap between life and death. Margaret's obsession with the photograph had led her to a discovery that would change everything. In a last-ditch effort to understand the forces at play, she consulted a well-known historian specializing in paranormal occurrences. Dr. Simon Cole, a former professor of metaphysical studies, had spent years investigating supernatural phenomena. He had written extensively on the idea that certain events, people, and objects were bound to moments in time, unseen forces that could sometimes bring the dead back into the living world. Dr. Cole was initially skeptical when Margaret presented the photograph. He had seen his fair share of hoaxes and misinterpretations over the years, but as he studied the image closely, his skepticism turned to alarm. He pointed out a subtle but significant detail in the photograph that no one had noticed before. A shadowy figure standing just behind Alice, barely visible, yet unmistakably present. This figure had the silhouette of a man, tall and imposing, but there was something deeply unnatural about it. Its limbs were elongated in a way that didn't fit the proportions of a normal human being. It was as if the figure existed in the background, just out of focus, but still hauntingly clear in its unnaturalness. "What you have here, Margaret," Dr. Cole said in a hushed tone, "is not just a ghost story. This photograph appears to show a supernatural event that transcends time. The figure behind Alice, it's not a person, it's something else. Something ancient." Dr. Cole's analysis only deepened the mystery. According to his research, this kind of phenomenon was not unique. He described a rare but documented occurrence known as temporal rift manifestation, where the boundaries between the living and the dead weaken, allowing the deceased to briefly cross over into the world of the living. He explained that photographs, particularly those taken under highly emotional or traumatic circumstances, sometimes acted as portals, capturing not just the moment in time, but the essence of the event itself, allowing spirits or energies to linger in the image long after the moment had passed. This photo, Dr. Cole continued, might not just be a snapshot of a moment in time. It could be a window, a lingering imprint of Alice's spirit caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Margaret was stunned. Could it really be true? Could Alice's spirit have somehow been captured in the photograph, reaching out from beyond the grave? And what of the strange figure standing in the background, an entity whose presence was now undeniable? Who or what was it, and what connection did it have to Alice and her tragic death? To unravel the truth, Dr. Cole suggested a bold move. They would conduct a séance, attempting to reach Alice's spirit directly. Margaret hesitated. After everything she had learned, the idea of confronting the supernatural head-on was terrifying. But the need for closure, the desire to understand what had truly happened, drove her to agree. The séance was held in the very room where the photograph had been taken. As the candles flickered and the air grew thick with tension, Margaret, Dr. Cole, and a small group of trusted friends sat in a circle around the table. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, and the air felt charged with an energy that made Margaret's skin crawl. She closed her eyes, focusing on the memory of Alice, the little girl who had once been the heart of their family. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and a voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the room. "Margaret, Sarah." The voice was familiar, but it was not the voice of the living. It was Alice's voice, distorted, as if heard from a great distance. "Alice," Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. "Is that you?" "Yes," the voice responded. "But I am not here. Not fully." The séance grew more intense as the group attempted to communicate with Alice's spirit. But what they discovered was far beyond anything Margaret had imagined. Alice, it seemed, had not simply died. She had been taken. Her life force had been pulled into a dimension beyond their comprehension. The shadowy figure in the photograph, the one that had stood just behind Alice, was not a person at all. It was a guardian, an ancient entity that existed to guard the boundaries between the living and the dead. As the séance drew to a close, Dr. Cole whispered, "The photograph wasn't just a memory. It was a trap. Alice's spirit had been caught in it, unable to fully cross over, and that shadowy figure was the entity that had bound her here." The truth was more horrifying than Margaret could have imagined. Alice's death had not been a simple tragedy. It was the beginning of something far darker, a breach between the worlds that had allowed her to return, but at a terrible cost. The photograph, as it turned out, was not just a relic of a lost time. It was a symbol of something much larger, a supernatural rift that could never truly be undone. As the truth behind the photograph unfolded, Margaret was left with a profound sense of both relief and unease. The mystery of Alice's presence in the image had been solved, but the answers were far from comforting. The truth, that Alice's spirit had been caught in the photograph, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead, left Margaret with more questions than ever. What had truly happened to Alice in her final moments? Had she been aware of the forces at play, the entity that had bound her to this world? And most hauntingly, had Sarah known all along, feeling the presence of her sister even after death had taken her away? Dr. Cole's explanation of the temporal rift manifestation seemed to fit the facts perfectly. The photograph was more than a mere record of a family's memory. It was a portal, a window to a dimension that existed just outside their understanding of time and space. The strange figure in the background, the one that had loomed behind Alice, was a guardian, an ancient entity that prevented spirits from crossing over into the afterlife. Alice's spirit had been trapped, caught in that liminal space, unable to move on. The photograph, it seemed, had somehow preserved that moment, keeping Alice tethered to the world of the living. Margaret's heart was heavy as she thought about the years that had passed since Alice's death. She wondered how much of her own grief had played a role in creating this breach, this rift between the two worlds. Had her unrelenting desire to keep Alice close, to hold onto her memory, inadvertently caused the supernatural event that had followed? As the days passed, Margaret knew that she could not erase what had happened. The photograph would always be a part of her family's history, a symbol of the inexplicable forces that had shaped their lives. But she also knew that the photograph, like all things, had a life of its own. The spirit of Alice, though caught in the image, would one day find peace, whether through the resolution of the rift or through the intervention of the guardian who had protected her. In the end, Margaret made a decision. She would let go. Let go of the past, of the grief that had bound her family for so long. She could never fully understand the mysteries of the photograph or the spirit that it contained, but she could choose to embrace the love and memories that Alice had left behind. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and comment below. Do you think Margaret made the right choice in letting go? Or should she have tried to help Alice cross over? Let us know your thoughts.